Dear Madam President, sorry, we're still waiting for... Yes. Dear Madam President, dear delegation, dear diplomatic corps, dear guests, it is my honor and personal pleasure to host today at the Polish Institute of International Affairs a very distinguished guest, President Kolinda Grabar-Kitarović of the Republic of Croatia. It seems there is no better moment to talk about Croatian-Polish cooperation and the aim to consolidate Central European resilience. Both countries' heads of states were appointed last year and come with fresh ideas, and both countries have new governments with ambitious European agendas. Croatia is an immediate neighbor of the Visegrad Group and is already part of the V4+ initiative, in which the Visegrad countries cooperate with its neighbors and seek a common position on a whole spectrum of key European policies. Indeed, we do not share a border with Croatia, and the Dalmatian coast may seem far from home for over 500,000 of Polish tourists who visit Croatia every year. But while Zagreb may be 1,000 kilometers from Warsaw, Osijek is only 500 kilometers from Zakopane. If we look at it from this latter perspective, there is much scope for natural cooperation on security issues, including energy security, as well as on transportation projects, cohesion policy, and cultural exchanges. Our future common actions can easily be based on our existing good experience in these fields. Poland always supported Zagreb to become an active participant in Central European affairs, just as it has always supported Croatia's aspirations to join the European Union. Let me just briefly remind our distinguished guests and visitors that under Poland's presidency of the EU Council in 2011, the then Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk delivered the accession treaty to Zagreb, which later served as a basis for Croatia's membership in the European Union. Ever since, Croatia and Poland have shared the vision that the smooth integration of the rest of the Western Balkans into the European Union and NATO will serve to expand the area of political stability and economic prosperity in the region. Overall, our similar interests, together with the traditionally friendly relations between Poland and Croatia, constitute huge potential for closer cooperation between the two countries on bilateral, regional, and European levels. Madam President, we truly believe that the regular visits of Croatian presidents to our institute has become a tradition. Only 2 years ago, President Ivo Josipović spoke from this very place about the future of EU enlargement in the Western Balkans. But the list of Croatian guests in this institute is even longer. For example, on the 1st of July 2013, the day when Croatia joined the European Union, Ivan Del Vecchio, the then Croatian ambassador to the Republic of Poland, held a press conference on the newest EU member state early in the morning in this very room. To continue along this path, we now have the pleasure to hear from Madam President about Croatia's role in consolidating Central European resilience in a turbulent world. Madam President, thank you for choosing peace as the place for your public speech. We are honored to host you at the Institute. Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, please allow me to take this opportunity to share with you a very last information on our institute, which has made us very proud. PISM was ranked 2 days ago in a prestigious think tank ranking, the Global Go-To Think Tank Index, as the best think tank in Central Europe, as we are not only Central, but also Eastern, so Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the best think tank in the world, with a budget under $5 million. I would like to thank my colleagues over here at the Institute for their great work, which is appreciated not only nationally, but also internationally. My welcoming remarks will be followed by Madam President's speech. Today's meeting will be moderated by the Head of Research at PISM, Mr. Jarosław Ćwiek-Karpowicz, and after the speech, Madam President has agreed to answer questions from the audience. Dear guests, thank you for your attention, and Madam President, let me kindly invite you to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Madam Acting Director, for such kind words of introduction. And let me use this opportunity to congratulate you and the Institute on such a huge recognition. And of course, I wish you a lot of success in further work, and I hope that you will continue your cooperation also with Croatian think tanks, and that we will increase that part of our bilateral aspect of our bilateral relationship as well. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning to all of you. It's such a pleasure to be in Warsaw today on the third day of my official visit to Poland, which it has been only 3 days, but it seems like it's been much longer because we have done so much. When President Duda and I met for the first time, and yesterday and the day before yesterday was our fourth meeting in less than 1 year of my presidential term and about 6 months of his term, so which goes to speak how dedicated we are to promoting our bilateral relationship, but also our Central European connection and our joint initiative, because it's just happened to be that both of us came up with the same idea approximately at the same time of the necessity to connect the North and the South of Central Europe, because this truly is authentic Central Europe, to connect the Baltic, the Adriatic, and the Black Seas. He calls it the ABC initiative. Unfortunately, I cannot, because the Adriatic is Jadran in our Croatian language, so I have to stick to my native Croatian language. But nevertheless, the ABC is, I think, a very good term for cooperation between the three Cs, because it should be the basis of what we should be doing in the future, considering the state that we find our environment in, especially with respect to the new threat and challenges to our security, but also to many other challenges in the economic and all other sectors. So I'm very pleased to be here with you this morning to share some of my thoughts on the future of Europe and in Croatia's role in consolidating Central European resilience in this turbulent world. And I do foresee a much stronger role for Croatia. I have never kept it a secret that so far I have not been entirely happy with Croatia's foreign policy. I refuse the fact that some states would call themselves, or any other states, small. It's not about numbers. It's about what you make of yourself. It's about initiative. It's about assertiveness, it's about confidence, it's about vision and strategy. And I believe that we can do it, and we can do it especially with you, with Poland. So with Croatia on the southern flank of Central Europe and Poland on the north flank, connecting the area in terms of transportation, energy, but also people-to-people contacts, ideas, strategies, and working together in the context of the European Union, NATO, the United Nations, and elsewhere, we can give true meaning, and we can reinforce each other's policies, each other's interests, and together we can be much stronger. So each of us, we have responsibilities. We're responsible members of our societies, be it politicians, academicians, businessmen, or even as countries. We have a role in this process. And if we wish to ensure resilience, we have to look around and, of course, turn to our natural partners. Each century, each decade, and each year carries its own challenges. Today, more than ever, it seems that things are in flux, entire nations, entire populations. Things are changing at an unprecedented pace. We are increasingly faced with global threats at the local level, even at our own doorstep. Conflicts and challenges are not contained by borders and therefore demand collective action. The spillover of economic trends, natural disasters, and conflicts are becoming more and more evident. During the month of January, we often see a lot of forecasts of what we can expect of this current year. And it is difficult not to be concerned when we realize that everyone seems to be painting a rather bleak picture, both in terms of economic growth and global security when it comes to this year, the 2016. It was disheartening to observe that even Time magazine in the Year Ahead edition assessed that in 2016 it will become unavoidably obvious that the world lacks leadership, calling the state of world affairs a G0 world. When it comes to Europe, Time magazine forecasts that we will lack the unifying sense of crisis needed to forge collective action, and that a culture of the least common denominator will be manifested. Unfortunately, that's what we saw last year in the quibbles that we had, for instance, over the quota on migrants. And unfortunately, we have seen that when it comes to some of the other aspects of the crisis that we have been facing, from the economy to the situation in the MENA region, the Middle East and the North Africa and the Mediterranean basin. So are we really in a vacuum of power in international politics? Is isolation inevitable? Is this forecast too pessimistic, or is it a sobering one? Whatever we decide, I believe that we need to ask ourselves, as leaders and as individuals, what can we do to prevent further challenges and counter the effects of these demanding developments for our countries? Shortly after I became president of Croatia, I started a long conversation with the representatives of our political parties, of the workers' unions, with experts in different fields, with business people, etc. And we determined 7 different areas which are of crucial importance to Croatia, which are the biggest challenges to Croatia. And I believe that looking at those challenges, from economic to others, we all face the same. But the first challenge that came up and that absolutely everybody agreed on was demographics. The fact that we're losing people, that our population is aging, that soon we will not have enough workforce to feed the whole country and those who have retired, and that we are dying out as a nation. And all of us are facing the same problem. And demographics is not just an issue of that area per se. It affects, of course, the economy and the existence of a nation, and therefore is also a national security issue. So how to deal with it in Europe, in the European Union, will be one of the challenges that we're faced with. On the other hand, we also have migrant waves, which are partly results of demographics as well, of the youth bulge in the Mediterranean region, but also of many different aspects of many different crises, from poverty and illiteracy to extremism, to terrorism, to war and human suffering. To try to close ourselves off from the spillover effects of the wider world in this digital time would be a utopian approach. In my view, the right answer is to strengthen cooperation with your neighbors and your natural allies. For Croatia, this is Central Europe, with whom we have historical ties, a common heritage, and many shared interests. In my view, the right answer is to reinvigorate our historical ties, our economic, trade, cultural, people-to-people ties built centuries ago along the Amber Road, and to work together to find innovative ways to address new challenges. We do believe in the European Union, both in Poland and in Croatia. For example, in the last Eurobarometer survey, Croatian and Polish citizens are among the most optimistic about the future of the EU. In Croatia, 69%, and in Poland, 70%, respectively. And we're also most positive about the image of the European Union, in spite of the challenges that we're facing. In Croatia, 51%, and in Poland, 55%, respectively. These are positive numbers, but are not high enough. They're barely above 50%. So we do see an image problem as well. Consolidating or strengthening the ties within Central Europe is crucial in our efforts in addressing both existing economic trends and new security challenges. Central Europe, as I see it, from the Adriatic and the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea to the Baltic Sea, faces common economic challenges as well as geopolitical security challenges from both the East and the South. Historical ties between the countries are strong, particularly when I visit Krakow, for instance. I'm certain that many of you are familiar with the fact that Croatia and Poland were part of the same state contract four times over the centuries. However, I don't know how many of you are familiar, for instance, with an extraordinary example of our common heritage, an extraordinary inventor and innovator, Eduard Slavoljub Penkala. He was a man with great energy, vision, and enthusiasm. His father was Polish. He was born in Slovakia, educated in Vienna, and lived and worked in Zagreb as a high-ranking official in the Austro-Hungarian Ministry of Finance when he took on the Croatian name Slavoljub, as well as Croatian nationality. In 1906, he registered the patent for an automatic pencil, the ball pen that we still use today. It was an instant success in domestic and foreign markets. And today is actually almost impossible to imagine the world without a ball pen. His factory in Zagreb became some of the largest and most modern in Europe. Like so many historical figures from Central Europe, he's an example of how connected our countries are and the important part our citizens have played in the development and civilization of Europe. Unfortunately, the factory does not exist any longer, and that is also the result of the turbulent historical and economic reasons. However, as I said, we are all faced with similar negative trends, and we have to find ways to adapt to changes and to be competitive. Many of us are struggling with a low GDP per capita, high unemployment rate, particularly among our youth, as I mentioned, an aging population and demographics, emigration and slow growth, and dying industries. Poland is in a better position than Croatia. However, many of our challenges are similar. Poland managed to avoid recession through the 2008-2009 economic downturn and successfully utilized EU structural funds and attracted foreign investment, unlike Croatia so far, unfortunately. However, Poland and Croatia, like most Central European countries, have economic indicators significantly below the EU average, and this needs to change. We need to find innovative ways to boost our economies. We have to rebuild our ties, and through modern technologies and infrastructure, we need to create an atmosphere conducive for many future Slavoljub Penkalas. Yesterday, I participated in the Polish-Croatian Economic Forum, and I was happy to see that there is great interest among companies to cooperate, to do business together, to work together in third markets. Over 50 Croatian companies and more than 80 Polish companies were present. It is our job as politicians, as state people, to create an environment which will make their cooperation possible. When reuniting or consolidating Europe, as I prefer to call it, we have focused too long on fostering stronger east-west links and neglected our north-south ties. So President Duda and I share the opinion that we should strengthen the cooperation among the Central European EU member states, both in terms of economic and security cooperation. So for this reason, I am promoting the Adriatic Baltic Black Sea Initiative as Croatia's effort to encourage and to promote cooperation. The gist of the initiative is not to create a new regional organization, not to duplicate with the existing initiatives and organizations that we have, not to have a formal secretariat, but only to have a platform of action, of concrete action that will lead to concrete results, to concrete projects in the areas of the economy, of transportation, of energy security, that will connect our region and that will make it stronger. For instance, by strengthening the Polish ports in the north and the Croatian ports in the south, And by connecting them with modern railway infrastructure, we can do a lot to use the opportunity and the fact that the Suez Canal has been extended, that a lot more traffic will be going from Asia to Europe via our own routes if we do create them. Another example is connecting in the energy sector. We intend to build an LNG terminal in Krk. You're almost complete with your own LNG terminal. By connecting them and by building connectors from our side to Hungary, etc., we will ensure for for energy independence, for energy security, and of course that will lead to further improvement of our economy, to the fact that the living standards of the people will also be improving with lower energy prices. So we plan to focus on very concrete projects, and I plan to have our first formal meeting this early summer in Croatia. It would be sort of a political summit, but it would also be conducing to different meetings, beginning with young people, for instance, with people-to-people contacts, and of course with different economic meetings and roundtables that will again lead to specific projects. In all of that, we also have to be able to use not just the EU funding, but for an investment that is available. And if we work together, I believe that the potential for using that investment at a lower cost is much greater. Also, looking at the possibility of creating another type of Interreg program for Central Europe will be one of our goals, and this is what we will be exploring in the months to come. So, even China has recognized the potential significance of this project, and both President Duda and myself have visited China recently. And the Chinese, for instance, have expressed an interest in using the transportation interconnections in order to place their own products in the European Union. And they followed up our discussions with very specific, very concrete initiatives. So we have the responsibility to raise the competitiveness of our industries. We have the responsibility to be more assertive and the potential to be more prosperous. What it requires, of course, is to be a lot more assertive in our joint cooperation. We need to ensure security for our citizens and an environment that will be a lot more predictable and that will be a lot more secure. Reflecting on my discussions with your leadership over the past 2 days, I leave Warsaw confident that we are creating such a partnership that is needed to lead the Central Europe and the European Union forward. So allow me to conclude my introductory remarks by quoting a dear friend of Croatia, someone who has inspired me and my nation and who has worked wholeheartedly on bringing people and nations together, the Holy Father, St. John Paul II, who once said, "The future starts today, not tomorrow." Thank you.
Madam President, please allow me to begin by congratulating you on a great, informative, very concrete speech, and with a very clear message that cooperation between Croatia and Poland is crucial for building a strong political and economic bloc in Central Europe within the NATO and EU structures. And thank you for underlying all chances and profits which are in front of us, but also problems which we share, like demographics or migration. And not only in my opinion, but I think that in the opinion of many Polish experts and diplomats, Croatia becomes a natural partner for Poland in enhancing regional cooperation between Baltic, Adriatic and the Black Seas. So, Madam President, thank you once again that despite many duties related to your first official visit in Poland, it's not the first time when you meet Polish politicians, but it's the first official visit in Poland, and you found a time to visit us and to answer questions which we as a think tank community definitely have and would like to ask you. So please let me be frank, and this is what think tankers are doing, that we try to ask, very sometimes hard questions. Definitely this regional cooperation in Central Europe, especially in terms of strengthening our security, could not be perceived very positively by big players, especially Russia. Moreover, in Western Europe, the need to restore NATO's cooperation with Russia, despite its involvement in Ukraine war, is more and more visible. So my question is, to what extent and in what areas, if any, should NATO get back to regular cooperation with Russia, and how Central Europe should act commonly in this regard?
Thank you very much. Yes, sorry. Thank you. I guess. Well, thank you very much for the question, and there are no difficult questions. Some of them are easier to answer, some are not. I know that in Poland, of course, the sentiments toward Russia are a lot stronger than, for instance, in Croatia, where we have another set of, I won't say problems, but challenges still in the region of what I prefer to call Southeast Europe rather than the Western Balkans, because the term Balkans to me is not only reminiscence of the past conflicts, but also has become kind of a synonym for ghettoization of the region that for years is trying to become part of the EU and NATO and to reintegrate into the European family. And so far we have failed to complete the consolidation of Europe in that area. So we were perhaps faced with a bit of a different set of problems right now, and also being on the route of migrant waves, and with more than 600,000 people who have crossed Croatia, and some of them are now returning from the countries where they wanted to go to. We're concentrating more on these aspects and on strengthening the southeast flank of NATO and of the European Union. However, yes, the relationship towards Russia is very important. Now, I personally and Croatia, we stand on the opinion that we need to protect the heritage of the international law, to protect the principles of state sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence, as well as the right of every single nation to choose their own future. We have gone through a similar process ourselves back in the 90s. So we can sympathize and empathize with what is going on. We also look at the security threats very realistically. But in our relationship with Russia, we have to be very careful, because if you treat someone as an adversary, there will soon become one. And of course, both Russia and NATO member countries face the same security challenges nowadays with extremism, terrorism, but also the economic situation, demographic trends, etc. So we need to be firm in our position in terms of protecting the postulates of international law and the state order of the 21st century, but also have to find a mode of how to work with Russia together, for instance, in Syria. In order to resolve the migrant crisis in Europe, we cannot do it through a distribution of quota. That's just a distraction from the real problem. We have to do it at the source, which is mostly war, but also poverty, illiteracy, as I mentioned. So working with Russia will be absolutely necessary in Syria. In terms of re-establishing cooperation between NATO and Russia, as you know, Russia is a member of Partnership for Peace. And there was a partnership program, and during my time at NATO, I was actually quite involved in many aspects of our partnership. We're working together in Afghanistan to
joint research on preventing terrorist attacks, etc. It was also made clear by NATO that cooperation, as usual, cannot continue for as long as we're looking at these breaches of international law. So absolutely, I think, is necessary to cooperate in terms of combating terrorism and to look at ways how we can stabilize the Middle East and the North African region. Again, continuing to insist on every single country, no matter how big or small in size, respecting the principles that we all have to respect.
Thank you, Madam President, for your openness and this conversation and what you said about not to antagonize countries which are outside of our structure, outside NATO and EU. It reminds me a question about Serbia, your neighbor, which for us maybe is also perceived as a country, what you said, of Western Balkans. And we still have this perception or misperception. However, it's a big difference between Serbia and other Balkan states. But with Serbia, I mean, taking into account your history, your heritage, what role for this country you may predict in the Central Europe cooperation, especially in the fact that Serbia is outside the NATO and EU, and how do you predict, let's say, the upcoming years and the perspective of so-called Serbia Europeanization or joining European structures?
Serbia is our neighboring country with whom we've had our history. However, I believe that one has to draw lessons from history, but concentrate on the future. And as I quoted St. John Paul II, the future begins today. So we need to look at our cooperation today and at Serbia's role today. Certainly I see Serbia, as well as our other neighboring countries, as I said, as members of the EU. Serbia has, for the time being, chosen not to become a member of NATO. They want to remain a neutral state. And of course, it's legitimate for any country to cooperate with Russia as well, for as long as we respect the system that is imposed by international law and by the European Union in our relationship. I see Serbia as a member of the EU, as I said. Of course, the path will not be easy. It's becoming a lot more complicated for every single country. We've seen that we always had a feeling that coming after the fifth wave of enlargement, a lot more was required of Croatia than it had been of the countries who had joined the European Union earlier. Well, I guess it's normal because the EU has lessons learned process. They see where mistakes were made and they will try to avoid them, which ultimately is good for the country because you're able to reform for the purpose not of EU membership, but really for reforming your own country for a better life. In a better Serbia or in a better Croatia in our case. However, it's also most important that the process does not go on for too long. Right now, we find ourselves in the midst of a fatigue that we see with enlargement, or what I prefer to call consolidation of the European Union, because this is a natural part of the European Union. So the EU is not enlarging onto another area. This is that's not the backyard, it's the house. It's part of the house. So we are in between that kind of fatigue and fatigue with reforms in Southeast Europe because the countries are becoming disillusioned with their EU and NATO prospects. And that's why it's most important that Montenegro accedes to NATO this year because it will send a strong signal to all of the other countries that the door remains open on both ends of Brussels, and that provided that you carry out your reforms, you will reach the goal ultimately of membership. Croatia will support Serbia on the way to the EU. We will support them politically, as we have. We will support them in practical terms without patronizing. We are there. We have our own experience from negotiations. If they want to use our experience, our experts, they're welcome to do so. But ultimately, it's their own decision and their own path. In the context of Serbia's accession, of course, what we will be insisting is fulfillment from the process of stabilization and cooperation in Southeast Europe, which is good neighborly relations, and resolving any open issues, and not posing any ultimatums, but insisting that we proceed in a good neighborly manner based on the principles of the Charter of the United Nations to close any open issues, and of course, for all of the countries in our neighborhood to have the same standards of the protection of minority rights that we have in Croatia.
Madam President, ladies and gentlemen, we have now about 20 minutes for questions from audience, so please raise your hands, and yeah, I see two, so maybe lady and then...
I will be first. So my name is Božena, Warsaw University, Balkan Studies. In your opinion, similarities and difference in conflicts, Russian-Ukrainian conflicts, and Croatian-Serbian conflicts in 95th, sorry, maybe it's a little bit provocative question, but I'm really interested. I naravno lep pozdrav od gospodina Ante Nazara iz Centra Domovinskog rata u Zagrebu za gospođu predsjednicu. Hvala.
Hvala lijepa. Thank you. Well, yes, it would take a while to look at the differences, but I can say that perhaps we saw in Croatia for the first time what we call today this hybrid warfare, because at the time it was a clear aggression. The former states of the former Yugoslavia became independent. We declared independence based on the 1974 Constitution that provided for the right to self-determination to all the nations, and there was the Badinter Commission, the International Legal Commission, that concluded that Yugoslavia fell apart, dissolved, and that the new countries are the former republics with the borders of the republics as they were in the former Yugoslavia, because as you know, the borders kept shifting and changing through history in our region. So Croatia used to be much bigger or smaller at different times in history. So we accepted that principle. And the war was taking place only on the territory of the Republic of Croatia. It wasn't taking place on the Serbian territory. So it was a clear aggression by then Milosevic's regime that was mostly carried out through the so-called Yugoslav National Army and rebel elements within Croatia. And we consider that aggression against Croatia. We had occupied territories that later on were either reintegrated, liberated by our own forces, or in the case of Eastern Slavonia, through the 1998 mission, the so-called Antares, I would say the most successful UN mission ever that actually resulted in a peaceful reintegration of that area. So that kind of hybrid warfare is what we see in Ukraine today. The proxy war, and we could go into many details, but when I was at NATO, I dealt with it in a lot more detail.
Thank you very much. And we have here, gentleman.
Józef Niżnik, European Studies Unit, Polish Academy of Sciences. What kind of changes in EU governance Croatia would support? We all agree that the EU governance is quite ineffective, and it certainly needs some changes. But we observe also there's quite opposite tendencies. Ones that would stress intergovernmentalism and preserving quite illusionary, but nevertheless still important for most of the states, sovereignty of the member states, or increasing the power of supranational organs of the EU. So what Croatia would support in this situation?
As I noted in my opening remarks, Croatia and Poland are among those countries who support the EU more than most other countries. But again, that support is in between 50 and 60%. So it is above 50%. However, I guess we do need to do more in order to improve the EU's image. When I was leading our campaign back in 2003 to 2008 on the EU accession, when we were trying to explain the advantages and possible disadvantages of EU membership to our citizens, we noted a couple of main concerns. One of them was losing national sovereignty after we had regained it in such a difficult way. And the second one was the potential of using national identity, of melting into the pot of the European nations so that sort of the Croatian language disappears in that. And I explained at the time that actually it was the opposite. It was the possibility that even though we share sovereignty in certain areas, to reinforce it through joint common European policies. And to also, by making Croatian language by one of the official languages of the European Union, to further strengthen the concept of language. And why people were concerned, because back in the times of the former Yugoslavia, there was an attempt to make this unified language that was called Croato-Serbian or Serbo-Croatian. And of course, when we became independent, we started reinforcing the Croatian language as such, which is based not just on the Latin script, but on our literature and many other aspects that define languages. So that was the concern of the people. My opinion is that we're still not ready for these super constructs that would define our policies. Even when we talk about the quota, the fact that it was the European Commission who devised the quota, I was very much against it, because I think that the solutions have to come from within, from the European nations, and that we need to work through the European Council and other councils and other aspects on the lower levels below that, but that are made of the representatives of the national representatives, where we combine our national policies. I think that we have to strengthen the common European foreign and security policy. For someone who was born and raised in Croatia and who was 23 years when the war broke out, I was very much disappointed with Europe's reaction in European policy at the time. Europe was completely unable to solve the crisis, as I said, not in Europe's backyard, but in Europe's home, in Europe's house. I was in Auschwitz 2 days ago, and I said, evil happened there. But evil happened later on in Vukovar, as we were witnessing it, in Srebrenica, in Sarajevo, in Omarska, and elsewhere. And again, Europe was powerful to stop it. And I remember all the enthusiasm when the war began, when there were these songs in Croatia to the European Union, stop the war in Croatia, etc. And all that we saw was a number of monitors going through Croatia, but inability to take a common stand in the European Union. So we realized that we do have to take the future into our own hands and defend ourselves. Now I hope that we do not repeat the same mistake with the crises that are happening in our neighborhood. I hope that we will have the strength to work towards a stronger European foreign and security policy and aid to the areas surrounding Europe, which is truly our immediate neighborhood, because those crises are affecting us as well. And first and foremost, it's also a humanitarian issue. When you look at children dying in Syria after years of conflict, you cannot but feel ashamed that you're European with the inability to do something specific to help those people. That for the whole summer and for the whole winter, we've been quibbling over the quota of people who have reached our shores. But we've done very little to aid the people who are actually in dire need of help, who are left back there dying of hunger, of diseases, that we're unable to do something concrete to stop that war that has been going on for years, and that has caused hundreds of thousands of people to die. My solution for that, of course, it's a very long-term solution, but we need to start working on that today. It's a combination of diplomacy, effort, of defense, fighting extremism, terrorism, ISIL, and others, and development aid. Because the roots of all of these crises are not the conflicts themselves, but but the poverty, the illiteracy, and the intolerance that is spread in areas where you have such dire economic circumstances that necessarily always lead to a security crisis as well. That's one of the areas. In other areas, obviously, the monetary policy, a lot more control if you want to be part of the monetary union, strengthening some kind of common economic aspect of what we do. And ultimately, when it comes to migrations, we will have to have a common position, but leave migration as within the scope of the interest or the competence of every single individual state to decide on the migratory policies, the migration policies of every state of the European Union.
Thank you. And now we have last two questions. So Mr. Henry Foy from Financial Times and Darek Kawan from PISM.
Madam President, thank you for your speech. You've talked about the need for real actions to tackle the migrant crisis. If nothing was to change in the next 3 months, would you support the European Commission's threat to expel Greece from Schengen and to close the Greek-Macedonian border?
I don't think there is a yes or no answer to that question. If you followed what I've been talking ever since last summer, I was very much critical of the quota policy. I thought it was a distraction from the real problem, and that is resolving, well, as I said, the root causes. But in the immediate, in the long, in the medium term, trying to sort things out outside of the union's borders. So we as Croatia are not the first country of acceptance of migrants. Obviously, when it comes to the EU, it's Greece. So the tight control of the Greek-Turkish border is absolutely necessary. But also investing into, I don't like to call them camps because they're so reminiscent of some other types of camps that we had in the history. But refugee centers where we could really provide for the right circumstances that pertain to human security as such, meaning not just security from conflict, but also an opportunity for social security, for education, for healthcare, etc. A very complicated issue. For me, this is a crisis to stay that we will be facing for years to come. 50 to 60,000 people around the world are migrating. More will be migrating with climate change, and we don't know how these conflicts will go if we don't start managing them, if we don't start dealing with the consequences of the youth bulge, of the so-called Arab Spring, and consequently of our own action, former action in those areas, and the need to work with third countries and not just taking care of the refugees, but working with all of these countries to try to bring about the conditions of peace and security. Of course, many of these, or the bulk of the migrants, are economic migrants. And I was myself in one of the refugee centers or migrant centers in Croatia for about 3 hours. And of course, you can't learn everything about migrants in 3 hours, but you can get a sense of what it's about. So most people were young men, ages about 20 to 45, 50. And I asked them questions. Well, they were very happy to respond, to answer those questions. And they told me that they were actually, that their families were left behind wherever they were coming from. And they want to go to Germany because they want to earn money. And of course, I really do believe in the right of every single person in this world to have a better life. But the question is the European Union able to absorb, and how many people we can absorb? For Croatia, it's very little because the circumstances are as such. But definitely taking the immediate action outside of the European Union in third countries is this a short-term solution. And the long-term solution, or the medium-term solution, should be strengthening all of our borders. I am really unhappy that we now have barbed wire on the borders between Croatia, Hungary, and Slovenia. I hope that wire will disappear soon. But for that, we need to talk to our neighbors. We need to assist Serbia and Macedonia. We need tight control, not closing down, but tight control of the borders. And we need to agree with our European partners who are ready to accept refugees or migrants on what the numbers will be, what the criteria will be, and that we cooperate in all that rather than just throwing the problem into other countries' lap.
Okay, before the last question, I would kindly ask you from a security reason just to remain in place until Madam President leaves the floor. And now the time for the last question. Mr.
Dariusz Kawan, I'm the head of Central EU project here at Polish Institute of International Affairs. And as a Central Europe analyst, I'm always delighted to hear about ABC project, or well, as we sometimes call it here in Poland, the Intermarum project, and the idea to make Poland and Croatia sort of starting points of this project is of course very intellectually attractive. But my question is, my question is actually about countries that are between us, between Poland and Croatia, because not all of them are equally enthusiastic about strengthening Central European cooperation. Not all of them have similar understanding of the security challenges. Russia is a good example, I guess. So my question is, first of all, whether you share my doubts, and secondly, what strategy do you have to convince our Central European partners to join us? Thank you.
Thank you. I just realized I haven't completely answered to your first question of what I see Southeast Europe. Yeah, I do see it when they become members of the EU as part of that initiative as well. Yep. It's only natural that we fill in that space. And let me just underline that that there have been misinterpretations of the initiative as of creating some kind of cordon sanitaire towards Russia, that it's a US initiative, etc. No, it's an authentic initiative that comes from within of Central Europe. And as I said, President Duda and myself came up with the idea approximately at the same time. Yes, I know that there is that we don't see the same enthusiasm in all the countries right now. I organized an exploratory meeting in New York on the margins of the UN General Assembly last year. All the countries did attend, all the invited countries did attend that meeting. And I believe that, of course, no initiative has ever been received with an acclamation, but that shouldn't discourage any of us. We need to work towards overcoming any potential obstacles, but first and foremost by demonstrating the advantages of this initiative to all the countries, the advantages of concrete projects and concrete cooperation between us. And I can't see why everyone would not be ready to accept the projects of common infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, energy infrastructure, digitalization of the region, of attracting investment, of strengthening our economies. So I expect that even those who might be a little bit skeptical right now to wholeheartedly become part of the individual projects. Again, this isn't an attempt to create a regional organization or a permanent structure. This will just be a platform for cooperation and, most importantly, for action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam President. The time, unfortunately, is coming to the end. Thank you very much for sharing with us your enthusiasm. I would like to wish you good luck, and also for your national handball team in semi-final. So thank you once again, and please join me in thanking Madam President.
Thank you.